Thank you, everyone, for attending, and welcome to our webinar, From Risk to Return on Investment, ROI, Turning Compliance into a Competitive Advantage. My name is Jay Trinkus, and I'm the Data Protection Officer and Chief Information Security Officer here at Thoropass. I lead Thoropass's internal compliance program. Thoropass is a compliance automation platform and audit service in one, built for security and compliance teams. I'll be your moderator today, and I'm very excited to dive into this conversation on shifting compliance from a burden to a strategic advantage. Before we get started and I introduce our guest, this is a recorded webinar, but if you have any questions, please drop them in the QA. We have Thoropass team members here who are happy to answer any questions you might have. To set the agenda for today, we will start by framing the current landscape of healthcare compliance, regulatory pressures, and new security initiatives being proposed. From there, we'll explore how leading organizations are rethinking compliance, not just for risk reduction, but as a driver of resilience and innovation. Our experts will be able to take you through their experience being a part of healthcare organizations that have aligned compliance with business growth to accelerate deals and readiness while maintaining a formidable security posture. Now, let's introduce our guest speakers. We have a couple of wonderful panelists that are seasoned experts on the world of healthcare compliance, Ryan Freeman-Jones and Catherine Kelton. I'd love to pass it on to our speakers to introduce themselves. So, Ryan, why don't we start with you? Please introduce yourself to our audience.
Great. Thank you, Jay. Ryan Freeman-Jones here, as mentioned, and I am the cybersecurity and compliance leader at Simple Practice, and I'm very much looking forward to talking through our topics for today.
Great. And Catherine, please tell everyone a little about yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Jay. Nice to be here today. My name is Catherine Kelton. I'm currently the General Counsel of VHI Corp., formerly known as Vault Health, and I've been in the healthcare regulatory space as a lawyer and compliance officer for about 25 years.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both for joining. So let's just jump right into our discussion. So the healthcare industry, as you know, is constantly under attack. Over the last few weeks, even, we've seen a couple big regional healthcare networks take their systems down or were impacted by cyber attacks, such as Covenant Health in New England area and Ohio-based Kettering Health. But after so many years of being in the crosshairs of attackers, why do you think healthcare is still so vulnerable?
So, right, the news hasn't been great. I understand, generally speaking, the breach data looks like it's about 240 times what it used to be. And that is thanks to hackers and much more sophisticated threat vectors. And I think it's because the data can be sold, it is marketable. And so healthcare systems have often been, although we're seeing this improve, have often been a little bit behind other technology. And so I think hospitals and healthcare systems are still seen as a pretty vulnerable asset.
Yeah. Ryan, anything to add on that?
And I think we are also seeing, a time period where AI generated attack patterns are really cropping up. And so even more of a threat to healthcare environments that we're starting to see and really requiring very specific mitigations and controls in place to prevent those from becoming successful as well.
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah. Catherine, I know, do you think the regulators are going to get tougher with more enforcement under the new administration? Do you think we are going to, or just kind of stay this course, just status quo as it's been going?
Yeah, that is really anyone's guess, right? I mean, I know it's hard to avoid the news these days, but the back and forth has been pretty consistent around what's burdensome for individuals or entities to comply with regulatory schemes versus, in the balance of protecting individual information. We've often looked overseas to Europe and other jurisdictions as a model, but those are typically viewed as more restrictive, depending on your point of view, or more secure, depending on your other point of view. And so I'm not sure where this will head, but I do think there'll be a lot of discussion about it.
Here in the U.S., we're too concerned with privacy and whatnot. But the HIPAA security rule had some changes or looking to have some changes. And so, Catherine, as a general counsel, we've seen the notice of proposed rulemaking come out to update the HIPAA security rules. What are your thoughts on these new rules?
This is a catch up, I think. It's the first update really in 20 years. And there is now some more discussion to your earlier question about this current administration and how they might enforce it. We'll see whether this ever gets to a final rule. But what's in there is essentially improve safeguards against cybersecurity. There's some discussion around whether or not those changes are too burdensome. Some of them, I think, Ryan and I would agree probably are overdue and are really should already be happening in a regulated healthcare environment. So documentation, for example, mapping your data flows, understanding who your vendors are, those things are pretty basic and should be happening in any security risk assessment under the current rules. I think eliminating the scalability of addressability requirements is the key here. Some industries and some types of healthcare providers or other entities subject to HIPAA will find those difficult to comply with. And so that's not a done deal. And then I would say some of the notice requirements are going to be pretty burdensome as well, particularly with respect to business associates and how vendors need to comply or do some more than just kind of annual check the box exercises. So that's my initial take, and we'll see what happens as it goes through the rulemaking process.
Yeah, right. They had the adjustable and required, right? And although adjustable wasn't necessarily optional, right? They are now kind of streamlining those things. And to your point in regards to some of the definition change and broaden change and stuff, what do you think, Ryan? What are some of the good changes to the rule, and what recommendations might you have that they could improve on some of the other ones?
Yeah, I agree with Catherine too that HIPAA is finally catching up 20 years later, which is great. One of the cool things though is the OCR Office of Civil Rights did point to recognize security frameworks, previously in recent years as the way to implement HIPAA, or a way to kind of have almost a better consideration should you have a data breach or whatnot. And so with respect to that, a lot of what the OCR has been pointing to, so NIST CSF, HITRUST, NIST 853, already sort of points to some of these new requirements. Now they're just being kind of formalized, or at least proposed to be formalized. So I think that's a benefit, particularly here this is not new. It's just now going to be, potentially, more enforced. And I agree, though, that I think the challenge is some of the organizations that don't have these things in place will definitely have some work to do to get these new controls in place.
Yeah. And so, I guess we can assume data breaches aren't going away anytime soon, and, maybe on the rise, especially in healthcare. Ryan, just kind of back to you. What do you think? What are your top 3 proactive measures you take or recommend that could prevent some of these breaches from happening in your organization and other organizations?
Obviously, prevention is really important. And so lots of work going into ensuring robust and layered security controls and governance as well. And so really getting everyone in the organization thinking thoughtfully about how to reduce risk. But in addition to that, we also have to plan for the worst. And that's what we see in sectors outside of healthcare that have a little bit more budget and funding. They are constantly practicing their incident response tabletops, run books, iterating on those, making sure that they're ready. So should, I don't want to say the inevitable, but should, what we don't want to happen, a breach to happen, they have plans in place to actually, work through those impacts.
Absolutely. So, Catherine, you've been in compliance space for a while, and what have you seen change over time as compliance in a traditional view versus what compliance might mean to companies today?
Sure. Well, I'm thrilled to be talking about compliance as a strategic advantage. I think those of us who've been around a long time have always seen it that way, but we're now seeing a much more mature, I think, response from companies who are eager to lead with compliance, right? And lead with safety and lead with security, which is great. And so that does, I think, like I mentioned earlier, it often means starting at the beginning of a design and constantly iterating your compliance along with your products. But now I do feel like there's a shift in the C-suite even, the thinking, even in the past 5 years, from compliance and legal or security as a burden, or a function to be, avoided or called when there's a problem to really one that's viewed as helping accelerate the business. So I do feel like we've moved from necessary to a benefit there.
About building trust, right? Building trust with the with your customers.
100%.
Ryan, you've been in the compliance space as well for some time. What are your thoughts? And maybe you can provide some real world examples of compliance, maybe driving resilience. You mentioned.
Yeah, I think I want to agree with Catherine as well in terms of getting compliance and security involved early on in product development. I think that's probably one of the biggest areas. And so, to real world examples, driving resilience, getting the organization to think security minded, compliance minded drives more than just building a feature and those outcomes. It drives kind of thinking about, well, how could this feature be abused or misused? And then helping product and engineering teams think through those as well. So I think that's really been important. So it's arming the business with understanding what could happen and how it happens, and then baking that into their day-to-day processes. And I've seen, with that approach, it really does drive resilience because at the end of the day, the compliance and security teams, while they can provide visibility and consult, it's the product and engineering teams that are really intimately connected with product development and getting code out and released. And so the more eyes that you can have on the issue, the better.
You mentioned, the product engineering team, right? I think before they've kind of added on security was kind of an afterthought, right? Now it's kind of being, like you mentioned, built in, right? Built in by default, built in by, design. I think the engineering, at least I get a feeling that they're stepping up their game when it comes to security and privacy. You think that way as well, Catherine? What do you?
I do very much. And I really love Ryan's example or thought about not just thinking about how a product might be used, but how a product might be misused or abused, which again, you see in other industries, but hasn't necessarily been top of mind in certainly the HIPAA space, right? But I think the other piece I would look is a robust know your customer, know your vendor type of program. Is another way to drive resilience and a good example of how compliance can assist with that. That can and should include, business associates. So HIPAA is just one piece of that process, as you know. But I do think looking at your bringing in your procurement teams and looking at how you might improve speed to market through an efficient process at the center for that type of vendor vetting is really key here too.
Ryan, you mentioned a few frameworks earlier. What are some of the key frameworks you like to work with, and why?
Yeah, I think, being in healthcare, NIST, CSF, and 853 are really important, as well as high trust. But with respect to being healthcare, critical infrastructure, NIST, CSF really does a good job of helping align there. And then when you need more prescriptive controls, you can look at NIST 853 and high trust as well. And that's been really helpful. And I think the other key, particularly around, with frameworks like high trust, is they do bring in other authoritative sources from states and more local regulatory bodies as well. So privacy laws and other regulations that might not be scoped in some of the others.
Catherine, any particular frameworks you kind of lean on?
I would say those are key that Ryan pointed out. I would just add on a related note, back to enforcement, that I have heard lately from local but also state regulators to partner with them early, right? So understand the enforcement landscape by understanding the humans that are involved, and work through them, see them as a partner. That can feel daunting depending on the environment, and certainly in healthcare. But shifting the mindset of really the business people to understand that partnering with enforcement agents early on to understand threat vectors and help them understand. And so it becomes really a mutually beneficial partnership. And I think that's pretty key to all of what we're talking about in addition to the technology upgrades.
No, I like that the partnership side. I like that. It kind of segues nicely into, this other topic. So, here at Thoropass, we focused on an integrated management system. It brings together several different frameworks, such as ISO 27001, which is security, the 27701 privacy. We also include a 9001 with quality and 42001 with AI, as well as high trust and of course SOC 2, attestation, right? We believe our compliance efforts are a competitive advantage for us to demonstrate trust with our customers and of course, move up market. A question back to you, Ryan. How have you turned compliance into a competitive advantage at your organization?
Yeah, I think, although we don't have a good framework for federal privacy regulations in the US currently, um, the customer base, particularly in healthcare, does expect their data to be secure and also kept private. And I think it's important for us all to recognize, unlike financial data, which can be changed, you can change a bank account number, you can change your credit card number. You can't change someone's medical record. And so, from a competitive advantage standpoint, really baking compliance in from day one in everything you do is really important, and I think shows that care, that standard of care that you have for your customers' data, particularly, as a business associate in healthcare. So it's really, really, really important. In addition, it's expected, right? So they expect to see that, and they expect to also see that you have some thoughtfulness to your approach. So it's not just the check the box compliance of the past where you're just trying to get by. Now is compliance driving actual privacy security outcomes and other outcomes in your organization?
Yeah, the outcomes, right? Catherine, how have you turned a compliance into a competitive advantage within your organization?
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. As we've spent a lot of time in the last few years, as you see the proliferation of health apps that may or may not be subject to HIPAA, right? And to Ryan's excellent point, consumers believe, they don't know whether you call it HIPAA or call it some other law or whatever, right? They think that their data is secure in your environment and that you're obligated to keep an eye on it. And so we've seen some pretty big breaches that had to be handled some other way in a different rubric than HIPAA. So I think as we look at personal health records and looking at broadening the definition of what's covered, that's a key way to have a competitive advantage. Sorry, and really think about beyond a patient. Who are your consumers? Who are your potential patients? Right? Anyone coming to your app, whether or not they've fit into the square definition of what a patient is or who a patient is who you should be thinking about as your audience for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Ryan, you mentioned, you touched a little bit on AI and AI is now kind of the wave for innovation, right? How do you drive innovation while prioritizing security?
I think that's a great question. I think it all goes back to the data itself. So what is the data? Is it sensitive data? Is it public data? Or is it PII, PHI, however you stratify your data, and then implementing controls to protect the data commensurate with the type of data that you have. But more importantly, it's not just compliance, security, legal, making those decisions for the business. It's really the business being armed with understanding, okay, if I want to introduce some AI tooling with, um, PII, what's the framework for me doing that? So there's going to be guardrails in place. There's going to be governance, but we want the business to be able to innovate and iterate quickly, but knowing and having that confidence that they're doing so in a safe way, but also making thoughtful decisions on their technology choices based on the governance frameworks you put in front of them. I think that's the biggest thing. Instead of, you know, security and compliance being the approver or denier, it's more working with the business and arming them with those decisions themselves to make the best use of this technology.
Yeah, resources are limited, right? We always got to do best with that. Catherine, what do you think? What are some driving innovation while prioritizing security?
Sure. Well, I think particularly in this environment with these headlines, security is really an innovative tool, right? So thinking about as you're doing market scans, as you're doing consumer scans, as you're trying to understand where the white space might be for your product or your industry, figuring out, asking those questions from a security standpoint, I think is the way to go. Because often, again, we might think we're answering a question of what the market is looking for without asking a specific security question. And I do think that would be a miss. So I think seeing security as innovation, particularly in healthcare, is an important differentiator.
Yeah, that segues nicely into this next question here, kind of marketing. You were talking about analyzing. Sometimes it's hard to quantify risk, right? And to make a business case for security. What are some examples you might have to quantify risk reduction and make compliance a business enabler, Catherine?
Yeah. So I've spent a lot of time in my career thinking about key performance indicators or KPIs for compliance, because you are often selling it as a necessary, aspect of your business, right? So I do think things like speed to market, that's one where I would say compliance can help address the efficiency of center-led processes, the things that go into your product roadmap and where you're going to insert compliance or security, and those risk assessments at the front end. I think you can often show that there's an efficiency to be gained. And I think that's the easiest way, because otherwise, the value of compliance is often the absence of a problem. And
Yeah, right.
that's pretty difficult.
It's hard to prove a negative, right? It's hard to prove a negative.
Yeah.
I feel like
Difficult to
a
demonstrate.
person internally too, as a CISO, trying to sell the ideas to my executives. But KPIs, Ryan, what do you look at?
Yeah, I think what's really nice right now is with AI becoming more mainstream in the market, there are actual methods and tooling that we can use to really quantify risk and really focus on qualitative risk analysis. And we're looking at frameworks like FAIR, for example, factor analysis of information risk. And so that's what I look to, because what I find is that it helps me tell that story to the broader business of how either the lack of certain controls, or the lack of certain maturity in security controls can factor into either positive or negative security outcomes, and then also the costs associated with that by either doing it or not doing it. And so that's what I'm starting to look to. And then in addition, there's the opportunity cost as well. So if you're not leading in the market in terms of your security and compliance posture in your organization, and your competitors are, then you're potentially losing out on that as well.
Yeah, yeah. So you kind of maybe answered this question already. Then, so how do you, how do companies align compliance with sales and partnership teams there, Ryan?
Yeah, I think it really goes really important to be upfront, honest about it, and then have lots of resources for your customers to understand what your posture is, how you protect their data, what they can expect of you. It absolutely goes into your contracting as well downstream, particularly as a business associate, with your business associate agreements with your covered entities, and vice versa. If you're a covered entity, then your agreements with your business associates, and then also being willing to answer those questions, right? If you're trying to hide behind information, then it's probably not a position you want to be in. You want to be upfront. You don't want to divulge specific security controls, though, either, right? I think there's some reason to be confidential about some of those, but it's really giving those customers that assurance that you have the right processes and frameworks and governance in place.
Yeah, we've got our trust center up and running, and it's been doing really well of being able to be transparent to our customers. And Catherine, as your general counsel, I'm sure you're probably reviewing contracts and whatnot and seeing some of these things. What are your thoughts on it?
Sure. I really do love the trend of moving everything towards a plain language, right, and readability. Click-through software agreements are, obviously haven't gone away, but they're not particularly user-friendly, and nobody reads that fine print. And that's where, a lot of your privacy requirements are buried, right? So if you look at some of the jurisdictions that require a little more user friendliness, I think that's the right model. And it's everything from, as Ryan mentioned, sort of how you're going to market and your materials, but whether or not you're D2C or B2B, I think there's a lot to be said for making sure that folks have it right up front that, right, you don't need to open all of your code, but certainly understanding where and how the security works for your end users is I do think a differentiator for sure.
Absolutely. Totally agree. I'm going to change the topic a little bit here. So, Brian, I know your organization, Simple Practice, has just undergone some compliance audits, like a lot of us do. We have year-long audits, but maybe you can provide us with some examples of challenges your organization face, or what some other organizations may face when it comes to compliance efforts, and what organizations might be able to do to overcome those challenges.
Yeah, I think the primary challenge for a lot of organizations is just the broad regulatory framework situation. So there's different state privacy and other sort of laws, particularly privacy and AI laws coming through right now, either proposals. I know right now, even the state of California is even has some proposed changes to the California Consumer Privacy Act. We've already spoken about some of the federal legislation around AI. So I think that's just one area is just the patchwork of regulations, and then keeping track of all that. And so that is a big challenge, I think, for a lot of organizations. And then just staying on top of all the changes, because they're happening all the time and in real time. So I would say that's probably one of the bigger challenges.
Yeah, Catherine, you seeing the same challenges? What other challenges do you guys overcome?
So I do think readiness is one of them, right? And also just talent. So keeping up, as Ryan noted, keeping up with the regulatory changes is burdensome, and it requires sometimes it requires an army, sometimes it requires a couple lawyers who do nothing but keeping track of changes across the state, depending on what where you're selling your products, right? But I also think that now we prioritize agility and hiring folks that can be flexible and can have a broader view. And like the challenge of being in that type of agile environment. So I think it is it's sort of required now as you're looking at bringing new people into the organization, figuring out that they're coming in with this mindset of partnering together to go to market, and keeping those your customers top of mind from a security standpoint.
Ryan, why do you think it's important to adopt a strategic compliance approach? And are you able to provide some, outcomes or results you've seen when it comes to streamlining your compliance efforts?
Yep, I think the biggest benefit is, although there is the patchwork of regulations, it's particularly in the US, when you have a strategic approach, you're generally not surprised, because while the different states have different ways of implementing these laws and kind of writing them, they are fairly similar. So when you're building your compliance program strategically, you're building it for all of these different regulations. In addition, it does help with some of the resourcing constraints that you do have, because you're able to plan for that now in advance, understanding how you're going to go about implementing these compliance programs and efforts in your organization. It's not just, oh, this one just popped up, let's go look at this. It's now let's taking that step back and having a unified program. And I think, working with vendors as well, like Thoropass, that make that easier in the platform as well, is really valuable, and has been, very, very helpful, at least for me.
I appreciate that. No payments. We haven't made any payments to them at all. And Catherine, any final thoughts?
Sure. I think, with my lawyer hat on for a second, if I think about how much merger and acquisition M&A activity there's been in this space over the last, 5-10 years, if you come at it with sort of this deal readiness approach where you've got everything cataloged and it's very organized, and you understand where your risk environments are, and you understand where the benefits and opportunities of your security program are and your compliance program, that's an excellent way to convince your internal stakeholders, but also, external stakeholders, either looking at your product or looking at your business, to say we have everything documented. We understand where the risk might be, and we can talk about all of the activity because we have it here. So that type of constant attention and audit and documentation becomes second nature when you have the right platform, and really kind of attunes everyone to how to talk about the benefit of what you've put in place and all the activity that's happened.
Outstanding. Thank you. So we're coming to the end of our webinar. I want to thank our guests, Catherine and Ryan, for their insightful and valuable knowledge. I also want to thank everyone for joining us today. And if you are looking to streamline your healthcare compliance journey and learn more about what Thoropass does, please reach out to us and using this link in the chat. We're here to bridge security and innovation. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks again, and until next time.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.